The Valorian Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 500,000 years. Their empire was so large that no one could count all their worlds. They owned over 2 million star systems across 9 spiral arms of the Milky Way. Every species they found had fallen before them. Every civilization they discovered had submitted or died. They were the masters of all they surveyed, and they had forgotten what it meant to be challenged. Commander Zorath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Supremacy. He was tall and gray-skinned with 4 eyes that glowed with cold intelligence. Behind him stretched a fleet of 10,000 warships. Each one could destroy a moon. Together they had ended more civilizations than Zorath could remember. He looked at the small blue planet on his view screen and felt nothing but boredom. This would be another easy conquest. Another primitive species to add to their collection of slaves. On Earth, Admiral Linda Morrison received the alien transmission at United Earth Command headquarters in Geneva. She was 53 years old, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many classified files. The message played on every screen across the planet. The alien commander spoke in a translated voice that was calm and certain. He gave humanity a simple choice: surrender within 72 hours or face complete destruction. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. The world erupted in panic. People ran through streets screaming. Governments held emergency meetings that accomplished nothing. Religious leaders called for prayer. Scientists stared at their instruments in disbelief. The alien fleet was real. The threat was real. And humanity seemed to have no answer. But Linda Morrison did not panic. She walked calmly to a secure room deep beneath the Geneva facility, where General Kevin Price and Director Nathan Cole were already waiting. Kevin was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, who had spent his life preparing for a war everyone else thought was impossible. Nathan was younger, thin and intense, the head of planetary defense since its secret creation 30 years ago. They looked at each other and nodded. The moment they had trained for had finally arrived. Linda picked up a red phone and spoke a single code word. Within minutes, similar calls were made across the globe. In Washington and Moscow and Beijing and London, leaders who publicly pretended to be rivals activated protocols they had agreed upon decades ago. The truth was that Earth had been preparing for this day for over 300 years. It had begun with the discovery of an ancient probe on the dark side of the moon in the year 1969. The Apollo missions had been a cover story. What the astronauts really found changed everything. The probe was 4 billion years old. It contained a message from a species called the Architects. And that message warned that one day, conquerors would come to Earth. The nations of the world had secretly united. They built facilities underground. They studied the probe and the coordinates it contained. They found something buried beneath the Nevada desert that defied all understanding. And they waited. In Nevada, Dr. Susan Grant received the activation call. She was the lead scientist of Project Prometheus, a woman of 45 who had dedicated her entire life to understanding what lay beneath her feet. She had short brown hair and glasses that she constantly pushed up her nose. Her hands trembled slightly as she authorized the awakening sequence. 20 years of work had led to this moment. Above ground, the Valorian fleet moved closer. Commander Zorath reviewed the data on the third planet, a primitive species barely capable of leaving their own world. Their weapons were laughable. Their ships were toys. They had detected some unusual energy readings from the planet, but nothing that concerned him. Primitive species always had some surprises. None of them ever mattered. He broadcast the Conquest record to Earth's population. He wanted them to see what they faced. On every screen appeared images of fallen civilizations. Magnificent cities reduced to ash. Proud species brought to their knees. Worlds cracked open like eggs when they resisted too long. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile. It was meaningless. Zorath had given this presentation thousands of times. The reaction was always the same: fear, despair, and eventually submission. He expected nothing different from these humans. What he did not know was that deep beneath the Nevada desert, in a cavern that had existed since before life crawled out of Earth's oceans, ancient machines were coming to life. Lights that had been dark for 4 billion years began to glow. Systems that predated human existence ran diagnostics and found themselves ready. Dr. Grant stood at the main console with her team around her. Colonel Dennis Harper, the military commander of the facility, watched her with steady eyes. Beside him stood Dr. Patricia Lane, the xenarchaeologist who had spent her career decoding architect symbols, and Lieutenant Commander Scott Murray, who served as the link between the scientists and the armed forces. Susan pressed her hand against the panel that had been waiting for a human touch since before the dinosaurs. The panel recognized her. It recognized her species, and it recognized that the time had finally come. She looked at her colleagues with tears in her eyes. They had succeeded where everyone thought they would fail. 18 months ago, they had finally cracked the interface. They had learned to communicate with the architect technology, and now they would use it. Colonel Harper contacted Admiral Morrison in Geneva. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of excitement he could not hide. The facility was online. The Nexus was charging. Earth was about to reveal a secret it had kept for longer than humanity had existed. Linda Morrison allowed herself a small smile. She turned to General Price and Nathan Cole. Then she addressed the unified command structure that linked every military force on the planet. For the first time in human history, there were no separate nations. There were no old grudges. There was only humanity facing extinction together. She gave the order to stand ready. They would not surrender. They would not submit. The Valorians had conquered the galaxy for 500,000 years because no one had ever been able to stand against them. They had grown complacent and arrogant and certain of their own supremacy. They were about to learn that they had made a terrible mistake in coming to Earth. Above the planet, Commander Zorath counted down the hours until his deadline expired. He expected surrender. He expected the usual groveling and begging that primitive species always offered when faced with annihilation. He had no idea that beneath his feet, a power older than his entire civilization was waking up. He had no idea that humanity had been chosen for a purpose greater than anyone could imagine. And he had no idea that his empire's 500,000 years of dominance were about to come to an end. The countdown continued. The fleet waited. And in the darkness beneath the earth, something ancient opened its eyes. 5 miles below the Nevada desert, Colonel Dennis Harper led his team through corridors that no human had built. The walls around them pulsed with soft blue light. The air hummed with energy that made their skin tingle. Every step they took echoed in spaces that had been silent for 4 billion years. Dr. Patricia Lane walked beside him with a tablet in her hands. She had spent 15 years learning to read architect symbols. Even now, after all this time, the writing on the walls filled her with wonder. The architects had been a species so advanced that their technology seemed like magic. They had existed when Earth was nothing but molten rock and toxic gas. And for reasons humanity was only beginning to understand, they had chosen this planet for something special. The facility stretched for miles in every direction. Human scientists had explored only a small fraction of it. There were rooms filled with machines they could not identify. There were chambers containing objects that defied the laws of physics. And at the very center of it all was the Nexus. Susan Grant was already there when they arrived. She stood before a sphere of crystallized space-time that floated in the center of a vast chamber. The sphere was 30 feet across and glowed with inner light that shifted through colors the human eye could barely perceive. It contained enough energy to power a star for 1 billion years. And now, for the first time since the architects vanished, it was fully awake. Susan had connected her mind to the Nexus 18 months ago. The experience had nearly killed her. For 3 days, she had lain in a coma while her brain tried to process information that no human had ever received. When she woke up, she understood what the architects had done. She understood why they had chosen Earth, and she understood what humanity needed to do. Above them, 50,000 miles in space, the Valorian fleet moved into Conquest formation. Commander Zorath watched from his command throne as his ships took their positions. He had ordered this formation countless times before. The heavy cruisers formed a ring around the planet. The bombardment vessels moved into firing position. The troop transports waited behind them, ready to land once the surface resistance was crushed. His communications officer reported that the deadline was approaching. In less than 12 hours, the primitives would need to surrender or face destruction. Zorath felt no concern. No species had ever chosen destruction. They always surrendered in the end. Fear was a universal constant. But then his sensor officer made a strange sound. Zorath turned to look at the readings on his screen and felt something he had not experienced in centuries: confusion. Energy signatures were appearing across the planet's surface. They were impossibly large. They were impossibly complex. And they were growing stronger by the second. On Earth, people looked up at the sky and gasped. Lines of light were spreading across the continents. They formed patterns that stretched for thousands of miles. Cities remained untouched, but the land between them glowed with geometric designs that seemed to have meaning beyond human understanding. In the Nevada facility, Susan Grant floated 3 feet off the ground. Her eyes blazed with golden light. Her voice spoke in harmonics that should have been impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The Nexus had accepted her. The architect systems had recognized her species as worthy. And now she was becoming the bridge between ancient technology and human will. Colonel Harper watched with a mixture of awe and fear. He had seen classified things that would give most people nightmares. But nothing had prepared him for this. Susan was changing before his eyes. She was still human, but she was also something more. Patricia continued to translate the symbols that appeared on every surface of the chamber. The architects had known this day would come. They had designed Earth itself as a weapon against tyranny. The planet's core contained technology that could bend space and time. The moon was not just a satellite, but a focusing array for energies that could span galaxies. Everything humanity thought they knew about their world was just the surface of a much deeper truth. Lieutenant Commander Scott Murray reported to Admiral Morrison in Geneva. His voice was steady but carried an edge of disbelief. The facility was not just online. It was transforming the entire planet. Earth was becoming something new, something that had not existed in the galaxy for 4 billion years. Commander Zorath demanded answers from his science officers. They had none to give. The energy readings from the planet were beyond anything in their records. Their computers could not even categorize what they were detecting. For the first time in his long career, Zorath felt the cold touch of uncertainty. He tried to contact his superiors in the Dominion. The Valorian homeworld was thousands of light years away. Even with their fastest communication systems, a response would take time. He was on his own. He had to make a decision. His tactical officer suggested accelerating the timeline. If the planet was doing something unexpected, they should destroy it before it finished. Zorath agreed. He ordered the first strike to begin. 12 planet-cracking missiles launched from his bombardment vessels. Each one carried enough destructive power to shatter a continent. They streaked toward Earth in perfect formation. their targeting systems locked onto major population centers. New York, London, Tokyo, Moscow, Beijing. 12 cities that would become craters in moments. The people of Earth watched the missiles approach on their screens. Many prayed. Many cried. Many simply held their loved ones and waited for the end. But the end did not come. Space itself bent around Earth. The missiles did not hit an invisible shield. They were not shot down by defensive weapons. Instead, the fabric of reality simply redirected them. One moment they were heading for Earth. The next moment they were falling into the sun, millions of miles from their targets. Commander Zorath stared at his view screen in disbelief. He had witnessed planetary shields before. He had seen defensive weapons of incredible power. But he had never seen anything like this. The planet had not defended itself. The universe itself had protected it. In the Nevada chamber, Susan Grant lowered slowly to the ground. The golden light faded from her eyes, but traces of it remained. She looked at Colonel Harper with an expression that mixed exhaustion with determination. She told him what she had learned. Earth was not just a weapon. It was a beacon. The architects had designed it to awaken when the galaxy needed it most. For 4 billion years it had waited. Now its time had come. Admiral Morrison received the news and passed it to the Unified Command. Humanity was not alone. They had never been alone. They had been chosen, protected, and prepared for a moment that was finally here. The Valorians wanted conquest. They would find something very different. Patricia Lane looked at the symbols on her tablet and translated the final message the architects had left. It was simple and direct. "Rise," it said. "The time of tyrants is ending. Rise and take your place among the stars." And humanity, united for the first time in history, prepared to do exactly that. Commander Zorath had conquered 47 worlds in his career. He had watched civilizations crumble beneath his fleet. He had accepted the surrender of kings and emperors and presidents. Never once had he felt doubt. Never once had he questioned the outcome of a battle before it began. Now, for the first time in his life, he felt something cold growing in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling. It was fear. His fleet hung in space around Earth, weapons ready, shields powered. But his planet-cracking missiles had vanished into the sun without touching their targets. His sensors showed energy readings that his computers called impossible. And the planet below him was glowing with patterns of light that spread across every continent like the circuits of some vast machine. His tactical officer suggested a full bombardment. Every ship firing at once. Enough firepower to turn the planet's surface into glass. Zorath considered the option for a long moment before rejecting it. If the planet could redirect 12 missiles, it might be able to redirect thousands. And then his fleet would be defenseless, its weapons spent on nothing. He needed information. He needed to understand what he was facing. In 500,000 years of conquest, the Dominion had never encountered anything like this. On Earth, Admiral Linda Morrison stood in the command center in Geneva and watched the situation unfold. Screens around her showed the alien fleet holding position. Other screens showed the lines of light that now covered the planet. Her communications officers reported that panic was giving way to something else. Hope. The missiles had failed. The aliens had not destroyed them. People were starting to believe that survival was possible. General Kevin Price stood beside her, coordinating with military commanders around the world. Every nation had committed its forces to unified command. Old enemies stood side by side. Old grudges were forgotten. When facing extinction, the petty divisions of human history seemed meaningless. In Nevada, Susan Grant recovered from her connection with the Nexus. The experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She could feel the energy flowing through the planet. She could sense the architect systems coming online across the world and beyond. The Moon, Mars, stations hidden in the asteroid belt, satellites that had orbited in secret for billions of years. Colonel Harper asked her what came next. Susan took a deep breath and explained. The architects had not just built a weapon. They had built a network. Earth was the heart of it, but the network extended throughout the solar system and beyond. There were gates that could open passages across the galaxy. There were ships that could be awakened. There were weapons that made the Valorian fleet look like children's toys. But there was a condition. The architects had built safeguards into their technology. It would not activate for just anyone. It would only respond to a species that chose to fight. A species that stood up against tyranny instead of bowing to it. The technology was testing humanity. And so far, humanity was passing. Dr. Patricia Lane worked frantically to decode more of the architect's systems. Every hour revealed new capabilities. The facility in Nevada was just one of dozens hidden across the planet. Each one controlled different aspects of the network. Communications, defense, transportation, weapons. The architects had prepared for everything. Lieutenant Commander Scott Murray coordinated between the scientists and the military. He had trained his whole life for conventional warfare. What he was seeing now was beyond anything he had imagined. But he adapted quickly. That was what humans did. They adapted. They survived. They found ways to win when winning seemed impossible. Commander Zorath made a decision. He would send a ground force to Earth. His ships would provide cover while his troops captured key locations. If the planet's defenses were connected to specific facilities, he would find them and destroy them. He had conquered worlds with orbital defenses before. This would be no different. He was wrong. The first troop transports descended through Earth's atmosphere. They aimed for Geneva, trying to strike at the heart of human command. But as they entered the lower atmosphere, they found themselves unable to control their descent. Their systems went haywire. Their engines sputtered and died. The transports crashed into the ocean, hundreds of miles from their targets. Not a single soldier reached the ground alive. Zora sent more transports. They met the same fate. Something was interfering with any Valorian technology that entered Earth's atmosphere. His ships could orbit. They could fire weapons from space. But they could not land. They could not invade. He tried orbital bombardment instead. His ships fired concentrated energy beams at military installations across the planet. The beams bent around their targets and dissipated harmlessly into space. His railgun projectiles slowed to a stop before reaching the surface and fell gently to the ground like leaves. Nothing worked. Nothing penetrated Earth's defenses. And with each failed attack, Zorath could see his fleet's confidence eroding. His soldiers had believed themselves invincible. Now they were learning a hard lesson. There were things in this galaxy older and more powerful than the Valorian Dominion. Admiral Morrison watched the failed attacks and allowed herself a moment of relief. The architect technology was holding, but she knew they could not simply wait behind their shields forever. The Valorians would eventually retreat and return with a larger force. Or they would find some way to bypass the defenses. The only way to truly end the threat was to take the fight to them. She contacted Susan Grant in Nevada. The question was simple. Could they attack? Could they take the battle to the enemy? Susan closed her eyes and reached out to the Nexus. The answer came immediately. Yes, the network included offensive capabilities. Ships that could travel faster than light. Weapons that could pierce any shield. And gates that could open anywhere in the galaxy. But using these capabilities would require human pilots. Human soldiers. Human will. The architect technology would provide the tools, but humanity would have to wield them. Morrison smiled grimly. That would not be a problem. Across the planet, millions of men and women had already volunteered to fight. They had watched their world threatened with destruction. They had seen their families cower in fear. They were ready to strike back. In orbit, Commander Zoreth received a transmission from the planet below. A human female appeared on his screen. She had silver hair and cold eyes and spoke with absolute certainty. She informed him that his attacks had failed. She told him that his fleet was trapped. And she gave him a choice: withdraw immediately or be destroyed. Zoreth laughed at the threat. His fleet was the mightiest force in the sector. These primitives could hide behind their shields, but they could not possibly threaten his ships. He was about to discover how wrong he was. In Nevada, Susan Grant gave the order. Patricia confirmed the coordinates. Harper mobilized his teams. And across the world, ancient hangars opened for the first time in 4 billion years. Ships rose from hidden facilities on every continent. They were sleek and beautiful and terrible. They moved through the atmosphere without any visible means of propulsion. They climbed toward space with impossible speed. The first wave of humanity's counterattack had begun. And the Valorians, for the first time in their long history, were about to learn what it felt like to be the prey instead of the predator. Lieutenant Commander Gary Collins had been a fighter pilot for 12 years. He had trained in the most advanced aircraft on Earth. He had thought he understood speed and power and precision. Now, strapped into the cockpit of an architect vessel, he realized he had understood nothing. The ship responded to his thoughts before he even finished thinking them. It moved through space like an extension of his body. The controls were intuitive in a way that seemed impossible. Within minutes of his first flight, he felt like he had been piloting this vessel his entire life. His squadron numbered 50 ships. They had launched from a hidden facility beneath the Mojave Desert and climbed to orbit in seconds. Now they approached the Valorian fleet from an angle the aliens had not anticipated. The architect ships had emerged from a dimensional corridor that opened behind the enemy formation. Collins gave the order to attack. The architect pulse cannons were unlike any weapon humanity had ever used. They did not fire projectiles or energy beams. They fired concentrated packets of warped space-time that bypassed shields entirely. The Valorian ships simply could not defend against them. The first enemy cruiser crumbled like wet paper. The second exploded in a ball of white fire. The third tried to turn and flee, but Collins and his squadron were faster. Much faster. Within minutes, a dozen Valorian warships had been destroyed. Commander Zoreth watched the battle from his flagship and felt his world collapsing around him. His mighty fleet was being torn apart by vessels that had not existed an hour ago. His weapons could not track the enemy ships. His shields could not stop their weapons. Everything his species had believed about their supremacy was being shattered in real time. He ordered a tactical retreat. His remaining ships began to pull back, trying to reach a safe distance where they could regroup. But retreat was not an option the humans intended to offer. On Earth, Admiral Morrison coordinated the attack from Geneva. General Price fed her tactical data from every theater of engagement. The architect systems allowed instantaneous communication across any distance. She could see every ship, track every enemy, issue orders that reached her forces in the blink of an eye. Captain Nancy Palmer led the Marine boarding teams. Her mission was not destruction, but capture. Morrison wanted prisoners. She wanted intelligence. She wanted to understand exactly what humanity was facing in the wider galaxy. Palmer's team breached a disabled Valorian cruiser through a hull fracture created by the pulse weapons. They moved through the alien corridors with weapons ready, expecting heavy resistance. What they found surprised them. The Valorian soldiers were terrified. They had spent their entire lives believing they were unstoppable. They had never faced an enemy that could fight back effectively. When confronted with human marines carrying architect weapons, many of them simply surrendered. The few who resisted were quickly subdued. Palmer secured the ship and reported her findings to command. The Valorian technology was not as advanced as it appeared. Most of their systems were cobbled together from conquered civilizations. They had not invented their weapons or their shields or their engines. They had stolen everything from the species they had destroyed. 500,000 years of supposed supremacy was built on theft and intimidation. The Valorians were not conquerors because they were strong. They were conquerors because they had never faced anyone stronger. Dr. Patricia Lane received this intelligence in Nevada and immediately began cross-referencing it with the architect databases. What she found confirmed her suspicions. The architects had records of the Valorian species from their earliest days. They had been a minor civilization on a small world, unremarkable in every way. Their rise to power had begun when they discovered abandoned technology from a fallen empire. They had used that technology to conquer their neighbors and steal their achievements. Each conquest made them stronger. Each stolen technology added to their arsenal. But they had never truly understood the technology they used. They knew how to operate it, but not how to improve it. Their fleet was powerful, but it was the same fleet they had possessed for tens of thousands of years. They had stagnated, resting on their stolen achievements while the rest of the galaxy suffered under their rule. Susan Grant shared this information with Admiral Morrison. The strategic implications were significant. The Valorians were not just beatable. They were hollow. Their empire was built on fear alone. Once that fear was broken, the entire structure would collapse. Morrison made a decision. They would not simply defend Earth. They would take the war to the Valorians. They would show every enslaved species in the galaxy that the tyrants could be defeated. Colonel Harper mobilized a second wave of ships. These were larger vessels, capable of carrying troops and supplies across galactic distances. The architect network included gates that could open anywhere. Distance was no longer a barrier. Commander Zorath managed to retreat with a third of his fleet. He fled toward the nearest Valorian stronghold, desperate to warn his superiors about what he had encountered. But the humans were faster. A gate opened in his path, and a human battleship emerged directly in front of him. The vessel was massive, bristling with weapons that Zorath's sensors could not identify. Its design was elegant and terrifying. And on its hull, painted in letters that his translation systems could read, was a name: Spirit of Humanity. Captain Laura Bennett commanded the Spirit of Humanity from a bridge that combined architect technology with human design. Her crew numbered 300, all volunteers who had trained for exactly this moment. Beside her stood Commander Eric Taylor, who managed communications with the expanding human fleet. Bennett hailed the Valorian commander. Her message was simple: surrender or be destroyed. There would be no escape. There would be no negotiation. Zorath looked at the forces arrayed against him and made a calculation. He had begun this day with 10,000 warships. He now had fewer than 3,000. The humans had lost perhaps a dozen vessels. The math was undeniable. He surrendered. Admiral Morrison received the news with grim satisfaction. The first battle was won, but she knew this was only the beginning. The Valorian dominion stretched across the galaxy. They had millions of ships and billions of soldiers. Defeating one fleet was not the same as winning a war, but it was a start. And more importantly, it was a message. The message would spread through the galaxy at the speed of light and faster. A new power had risen. The conquerors had been conquered. The slaves would soon know that freedom was possible. In Nevada, Susan Grant felt the architect network responding to the victory. Systems that had been dormant were activating. Beacons on distant worlds were beginning to glow. Earth was the first to awaken, but it would not be the last. The architects had seeded defenders throughout the galaxy. They had hidden them on worlds the Valorians had overlooked. They had waited for the moment when one species would prove that tyranny could be resisted. Humanity had proven that, and now the galaxy would never be the same. The war for liberation had begun. The war lasted 3 weeks. To Commander Zorath and the remaining Valorian leadership, it felt like an eternity of nightmare. Human forces struck at the heart of the Dominion with speed and precision that defied everything the Valorians thought they knew about warfare. Gates opened without warning in the most secure sectors of their space. Human ships emerged, destroyed their targets, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Every strategy the Valorians attempted failed. Every defense they erected crumbled. But it was not just the humans who fought. As word spread through the galaxy that the Masters could be defeated, enslaved species began to rise up. Rebellions erupted on 1,000 worlds. Slave soldiers turned their weapons against their overlords. Collaborator governments fell overnight. The empire that had ruled for 500,000 years came apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. Admiral Linda Morrison coordinated the offensive from the Spirit of Humanity, which had become the flagship of the human fleet. She worked with minimal sleep, sustained by coffee and determination and the knowledge that every hour brought them closer to ending 500,000 years of tyranny. General Kevin Price commanded the ground operations, leading liberation forces on world after world. Colonel Dennis Harper ran special operations, targeting key Valorian installations and leadership figures. Dr. Susan Grant served as the bridge between human forces and the Architect Network. Her connection to the Nexus had deepened since the war began. She could feel the ancient technology responding to the shifting balance of power. Systems that had been inactive for billions of years were coming online. The architects had prepared for this moment. They had known that someday a species would rise to challenge galactic tyranny. They had left behind the tools to make that challenge succeed. The final battle took place in the Valorian home system. The Dominion had concentrated its remaining forces there, over 2 million ships gathered in a desperate last stand. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. The Valorian leaders believed that even the humans could not defeat such numbers. They were wrong. Colonel Harper stood on the bridge of the Spirit of Humanity as it entered the Valorian home system at the head of a fleet of 3,000 vessels. Captain Laura Bennett commanded the ship with calm expertise. Commander Eric Taylor coordinated communications with allied forces throughout the system. They were outnumbered more than 600 to 1. The difference was that they were not alone. Gates opened throughout the system. Ships emerged from a dozen different species, vessels from worlds the Valorians had conquered and enslaved. The former victims had become warriors. They had armed themselves with captured Valorian weapons and stolen Valorian ships and a burning desire for justice that made them unstoppable. More gates opened. Ships appeared that no one had seen in 4 billion years. Architect vessels, awakened from their long sleep on hidden worlds, joined the battle. They had been waiting for this moment since before the Valorians existed. Their weapons tore through the enemy fleet like fire through paper. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Valorian military had ceased to exist. Their homeworld lay defenseless beneath the combined fleet. Their leaders had been captured trying to flee. Their empire was finished. Commander Zorath was brought before a tribunal of 47 species, representatives of every civilization the Valorians had conquered. Admiral Morrison presided over the proceedings. The charges were read in 100 languages: genocide, slavery, the destruction of cultures and histories and peoples without number. 500,000 years of atrocities finally facing judgment. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. On Earth, the people celebrated. The war was over. The threat was ended. Humanity had faced extinction and emerged victorious. Fireworks lit up the skies over every city. Strangers embraced in the streets. For one shining moment, there was no conflict anywhere on the planet. Only joy and relief and the knowledge that they had survived. Dr. Patricia Lane returned to the Nevada facility with a new mission. The Architect Network had revealed only a fraction of its secrets during the war. There were databases containing information about billions of years of galactic history. There were technologies that could transform human civilization beyond recognition. There were connections to other Architect facilities on hundreds of worlds, each one containing knowledge waiting to be discovered. The work of exploration would take generations. The Architects had given humanity a gift beyond measure, and understanding that gift would become the great project of the coming centuries. General Price stood at the Geneva Memorial, looking at the monument that had been erected to honor those who had fallen in the brief war. The names stretched across a wall of polished black stone. Pilots and soldiers and scientists who had given everything to save their world. The inscription at the top was simple. They came as conquerors. They found humanity. Susan Grant gave a speech to the United Nations, broadcast to every corner of the earth and beyond. She explained what the Architects had truly intended. Earth was not just a weapon or a beacon. It was a test. The Architects had seeded life throughout the galaxy and hidden defenders among them. They wanted to know if their children would grow into beings capable of standing against evil, capable of choosing freedom over submission, capable of fighting for what was right even when the odds seemed hopeless. Humanity had passed that test, and in passing, they had earned a place among the stars. The first human exploration vessels departed Earth 6 months after the war ended. They carried scientists and diplomats and dreamers, all eager to see what lay beyond their small corner of the galaxy. They were welcomed wherever they went. The species humanity had helped liberate remembered their debt. The former slaves of the Valorian Dominion saw humans as heroes, as the ones who had broken their chains. Lieutenant Commander Gary Collins led one of the exploration squadrons. He had become a symbol of the war, the pilot who had led the first counterattack against the Valorian fleet. Now he led missions of discovery instead of destruction. He preferred it that way. Captain Nancy Palmer commanded a peacekeeping force that helped stabilize worlds still recovering from Valorian rule. She found purpose in building instead of fighting. The galaxy needed healing, and humanity was determined to help provide it. In the depths of space, on worlds the Valorians had never discovered, other Architect beacons began to glow. They responded to the awakening of Earth, recognizing that the time of waiting was over. Other species on other worlds would soon discover their own hidden gifts. Other defenders would rise. Admiral Morrison retired from military service and took a position advising the new Galactic Council, a body formed to ensure that no single species would ever dominate the others again. She had spent her life preparing for war. Now she would spend her remaining years building peace. The stars belonged to everyone. That was the truth the Architects had always known. That was the truth humanity had proven. And that was the truth that would guide the galaxy into a new age. 500,000 years of darkness had ended. The tyrants had fallen. And Earth, the small blue world that no one had expected to matter, had changed everything. The new dawn had come.